Sarah had always loved traveling in a simple way. She believed that the best stories and experiences were not found in luxury hotels or fancy resorts but in hostels, where strangers from all over the world came together. It was in these shared spaces where everyone lived with backpacks, shared kitchens, and laughter in the common room that friendships formed quickly, and sometimes, memories for life were created. On this trip, she had booked a small, cozy hostel in a coastal town. The salty air from the ocean drifted through the streets, mixing with the smell of fresh bread from local bakeries. The town was alive with travelers, street musicians, and the sound of waves hitting the rocks. The hostel was nothing fancy, just a two-story building painted with bright murals, but it had warmth. The moment she entered, she was greeted by chatter in different accents, the clinking of mugs of tea, and a notice board filled with photos of guests who had stayed before. After checking in, Sarah walked into the common area where groups of backpackers were sitting together, planning hikes and sharing stories about places they had already been. Most of them were lively, laughing loudly, talking about their adventures. But her eyes caught someone different, a guy sitting quietly at the corner table, reading a book. He didn't look like he wanted to join the noise. His posture was calm, and his eyes were fixed on the pages. A simple backpack leaned against his chair, and a plain water bottle sat beside him. Unlike others, he didn't have colorful scarves, bracelets, or travel souvenirs. His clothes were simple too, just a plain t-shirt and jeans. There was nothing that made him stand out, yet something about his silence drew attention. Sarah thought he looked like any other backpacker who might be shy or simply tired from travel. Many people came through hostels like that, quiet, keeping to themselves, maybe just passing through for a night or two before moving on. She didn't think much about it at first. Later that evening, while she was making pasta in the shared kitchen, the same quiet guy walked in. He politely waited for his turn, carrying a small bag of groceries. Sarah noticed how organized he was. He chopped vegetables quickly, cooked quietly, and cleaned everything without being asked. He didn't try to start a conversation with anyone, but when someone asked him to pass the salt, he smiled softly and did it without hesitation. That night, Sarah sat with a group of travelers playing cards. The room was filled with laughter, but she couldn't help glancing at the quiet guy, who was now sitting with his laptop, typing something. A few of the others joked about him, whispering things like, "That guy must be writing a novel," or, "Maybe he's just antisocial." Sarah laughed along, but in the back of her mind, she wondered who he really was. The next morning, she woke up early and went to the hostel kitchen to make tea. To her surprise, the quiet guy was already there, sitting with a notebook and a steaming cup of coffee. The hostel owner, a cheerful woman in her 50s, walked by and greeted him warmly. That caught Sarah's attention. He had already built some connection with the owner, even though he didn't seem to talk much with the other travelers. For a moment, Sarah considered saying something to him. But she hesitated. He seemed absorbed in his notes, and she didn't want to disturb. Still, she couldn't stop her curiosity. Why did he always sit alone? Why did he look so comfortable in his silence? As the day went by, Sarah joined some other travelers on a walk to the beach. The hostel group laughed and joked the whole way, taking photos of the waves and shells. They all had stories to share about their countries, their work, their families. It was easy to know things about everyone within hours of meeting them. But the quiet guy James, as she later learned from the check-in sheet at reception, remained a mystery. That evening, when everyone gathered in the common room for a movie night, James sat at the edge of the group. He wasn't avoiding them completely, but he didn't push himself into conversations either. When someone asked him where he was from, he answered in the simplest way possible and quickly changed the topic back to the movie. Sarah noticed that he never bragged, never made the conversation about himself. For the next couple of days, this pattern continued. Sarah saw him helping new guests find their way around the hostel, sharing groceries with someone who had forgotten to shop, and even fixing the broken handle of a kettle in the kitchen. He never made a big deal of it, never looked for thanks. He just quietly did what needed to be done. Sarah found herself intrigued. In hostels, most people were eager to talk about their travels, how many countries they had visited, what adventures they had survived, what they planned to do next. Everyone wanted their stories to be heard. But James was different. He seemed to carry his story carefully locked inside, choosing not to show it to anyone. One night, as Sarah sat by the balcony looking at the stars, James came out too, holding his cup of tea. For a moment, they both stood in silence. Then he smiled politely and asked, "Do you like stargazing?" It was such a simple question, yet it opened a doorway. Sarah nodded, and soon they started a small conversation. He asked about her hometown, her favorite place she had visited, and what she liked most about traveling. His voice was calm, and he seemed genuinely interested. But when she tried to ask him about himself, he gave short answers and smoothly turned the questions back to her. That night, when she went back to her room, Sarah thought about him more than she expected. He was quiet, yes, but not unfriendly. He was polite, helpful, and thoughtful. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something or perhaps protecting something. For now, all she knew was that James, the quiet guy in the hostel, was just another backpacker traveling light, blending in with everyone else. But somewhere deep down, Sarah had a feeling his story was different. She just didn't know yet how extraordinary it would turn out to be. The days in the coastal town moved slowly, in a way that made every traveler feel as if time was stretching. Sarah enjoyed the rhythm of hostel life. The mornings began with the sound of clattering pans in the shared kitchen, afternoons were filled with trips to the beach or hiking trails, and evenings often ended with music or stories in the common room. During these days, she kept noticing James. He was always there, yet always apart. He wasn't unfriendly, but he never tried to be the center of attention either. When others cracked jokes or argued loudly about who had the best travel story, James quietly sat at the edge, smiling when appropriate but never interrupting. Sarah found herself becoming more and more curious about him. She had seen him share food with a new traveler who had arrived late at night, too tired to shop. She had watched him fix a broken chair on the hostel balcony without telling anyone, just quietly tightening the screws and leaving it as if it had never been broken. There was something about the way he blended into the background yet always seemed to be helping that made her want to know more. One afternoon, the hostel group decided to plan a short trip to the nearby cliffs. The cliffs were famous for their view of the ocean, and many travelers loved to sit there at sunset. Sarah was part of the group, along with 8 or 9 others. To her surprise, James agreed to come along too. The walk was long but beautiful. The path wound through narrow streets, small villages, and fields filled with wildflowers. Everyone chatted along the way, laughing, taking pictures, and sharing snacks. James walked quietly, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, but always listening. At first, Sarah thought he was just avoiding conversation, but after a while, she noticed something else. Whenever someone asked him a direct question, he answered with thoughtfulness. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words were clear and precise. When one traveler complained about the difficulty of the uphill path, James offered a tip about pacing breaths, and it worked. When another worried about getting lost, he explained how to read the trail marks painted on the rocks. He seemed to know more than anyone else, even though he pretended to be just another tourist. As the group climbed higher, Sarah found herself walking beside him. "You've done a lot of hikes before, haven't you?" she asked casually. James gave a small smile. "A few here and there." "That's not the answer of someone who just started," she said, narrowing her eyes playfully. He chuckled softly but didn't add more. Instead, he asked her about her hometown, her studies, and why she chose to travel alone. Sarah found herself talking more than she had planned, and he listened with genuine interest, nodding as she described her love for the ocean and her dream to write about her journeys. By the time they reached the cliffs, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with orange and pink streaks. Everyone spread out, taking photos or sitting quietly to enjoy the view. Sarah sat near the edge, her heart calm in the salty breeze. James sat a little further back, sketching something in his notebook. Curious, she leaned over. "Do you draw?" He closed the notebook quickly but not rudely. "Just a habit," he said simply. Sarah smiled. "You're full of mysteries, aren't you?" For a brief moment, his expression softened, almost as if he wanted to tell her something. But instead, he looked at the horizon and said, "Sometimes, silence says more than words." His answer stayed with her as they walked back to the hostel in the fading light. That evening, after dinner, the hostel was filled with laughter again. A group of travelers played the guitar and sang songs in different languages. Sarah joined them, but her eyes often drifted to where James sat quietly, helping a new guest check bus timings on his phone. Later, as she was preparing for bed, she overheard a few hostel mates talking in whispers. "Who is that guy anyway? He never tells us much." "Yeah, he's definitely different. Maybe he's a writer or something big. Or maybe he's just shy." They laughed, but Sarah stayed quiet. She didn't want to join their speculation. She had begun to feel that James's silence wasn't just about shyness, it was a choice. He wanted to stay unnoticed, and she couldn't help but wonder why. The next day, the group planned another activity, a cycling trip to the countryside. Sarah signed up immediately, excited to see more of the town's beauty. To her surprise again, James joined as well. Riding through the winding roads, Sarah noticed how easily he handled the bike, even on the steep slopes. When one traveler's chain came loose, James fixed it in minutes, saving the trip from being delayed. Everyone thanked him, but he brushed it off lightly, saying, "It's nothing." During a rest stop under a large oak tree, Sarah finally asked him directly, "Why do you keep to yourself so much? Everyone here is curious about you, but you never talk about yourself." James looked at her quietly, as if deciding whether to answer. Then he said, "Sometimes it's better when people don't expect anything from you. It makes life simpler." Sarah tilted her head. "But don't you want people to know who you are? Your story?" He gave a faint smile. "Maybe one day. But for now, I like it this way." His words puzzled her even more. She couldn't tell if he was hiding something painful or simply protecting his privacy. Either way, she respected his choice, though it didn't lessen her curiosity. Back at the hostel, life went on as usual. Travelers came and went, some staying only a night, others a week. Sarah noticed how quickly people formed groups and moved on, but James remained constant, always in the background, always kind, always silent. One night, while everyone was sharing their wildest travel experiences, James was asked about his. "What about you, James? What's the craziest thing you've done while traveling?" The room went quiet, waiting for his answer. He hesitated, then said, "I once camped on a mountain top alone. The stars felt so close, it was like you could touch them." The group waited for more, but he stopped there. Someone joked, "That's it? No near-death experiences? No wild animals?" James only smiled. Sometimes the simple moments are the best stories. The group laughed and moved on, but Sarah watched him carefully. There was something in his eyes, something unspoken. It wasn't that he had no stories, it was that he chose not to share them. That night, lying in her bunk bed, Sarah realized how different he was from everyone else. People usually wanted to impress, to prove something, to show that their journey was more adventurous than others. But James didn't care about that. He seemed comfortable being invisible, blending into the background. And yet, there was a quiet strength about him, as if he carried a life much bigger than what anyone could guess. Sarah felt a strange excitement. She didn't know what his story was, but she was certain of one thing: James was not just another backpacker passing through. Something told her that sooner or later, she was going to find out. The days passed, and Sarah's curiosity about James only grew. By now, she had accepted that he wasn't like the other travelers. He didn't chase adventures for photos, didn't join noisy games to prove himself, and didn't tell stories to win attention. He seemed content living in his quiet corner, yet whenever someone needed help, he was the first to step in. Sarah found herself watching him more closely. Sometimes she caught him scribbling notes in his small notebook. Other times, she noticed how carefully he observed the world around him: the waves crashing on the rocks, the birds circling above, even the way the hostel's old ceiling fan creaked when it turned too fast. He seemed to notice details others ignored. One evening, the hostel group decided to plan a hike to a viewpoint on a nearby hill. It wasn't too far, but the trail was known to be tricky. Sarah joined immediately, excited for the adventure. To her surprise, James agreed to come too. The next morning, the group set off early. The trail began with an easy path through the woods, filled with the smell of pine and the sound of birds. But soon, the path became steeper and narrower. Some of the travelers struggled, breathing heavily and stumbling on loose rocks. Sarah herself felt her legs ache as the climb grew more difficult. James, however, seemed completely at ease. He walked steadily, never rushing but never slowing down too much either. When someone slipped, he offered a hand. When another complained about thirst, he pulled out an extra bottle of water from his bag and handed it over without hesitation. As they climbed, Sarah fell into step beside him. "You're good at this," she said, wiping sweat from her forehead. James shrugged lightly. "It's just about patience. One step at a time." "Still," she insisted, "you act like you've done this 100 times before." He gave her a small smile but didn't answer. Instead, he pointed at the sky. "See those cloud patterns? That usually means the weather will stay clear for the rest of the day." Sarah looked up, surprised. "How do you know that?" He paused for a moment before replying, "I read a lot. And sometimes, you just learn things by watching." His answer only deepened her curiosity. How could a simple backpacker know so much about weather, hiking, and even small survival tips? There was something more to him, she was sure of it. When the group finally reached the top, they were rewarded with a breathtaking view. The ocean stretched endlessly, shimmering under the golden sun, while the small town below looked like a painting. Everyone cheered, took photos, and celebrated the climb. James, however, didn't pull out a camera. Instead, he sat quietly on a rock, pulling out his notebook again. He scribbled something quickly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Sarah couldn't resist. She walked over and asked, "What do you keep writing in there?" He closed the notebook gently and looked at her with a calm expression. "Thoughts? Observations. Nothing too interesting." "Can I see?" she asked, half joking but half serious. He shook his head with a small smile. "Not yet." There was something in his voice that made her think he wasn't rejecting her, just waiting for the right time. She didn't push further. On the way back down, Sarah noticed more hints. James seemed to know exactly how to handle the steep slopes, guiding others on where to place their feet. When the group lost the trail for a few minutes, he quickly found the right direction, pointing out faded trail marks no one else noticed. It was as if he had done this kind of thing countless times before. That night, back at the hostel, the group sat together, exhausted but happy. They laughed about the climb, joked about how unfit some of them were, and shared food. James, as usual, stayed quiet. But Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the details she had noticed. Later, When most of the others had gone to bed, she found James sitting on the balcony, looking at the stars. She joined him, feeling the cool night air on her face. "You're different, you know," she said softly. He glanced at her, curious. "Different how?" "You don't act like the others. You don't talk about your adventures, but you clearly know more than you say. Today, you helped everyone without even trying. And that notebook of yours, it's not just random thoughts, is it?" For a moment, James stayed silent. Then he sighed, a faint smile on his lips. "Maybe I just prefer listening instead of talking." Sarah leaned back against the chair. "Or maybe you're hiding something." He chuckled, but he didn't deny it. "Instead," he said, "sometimes people make too many assumptions when they know too much. I'd rather be underestimated." His words struck her. It wasn't just shyness, it was intentional. He wanted people to see him as ordinary, maybe even invisible. But why? The following days only added to her questions. Whenever the hostel group planned something, James joined quietly, never drawing attention but always helping. On a boat ride, he seemed to know more about the tides and currents than the guide himself. On a bike ride through the countryside, he fixed a broken chain like a professional mechanic. Sarah began to wonder, who was he really? One afternoon, when the group returned from town, they found James sitting on the steps outside the hostel, sketching the coastline. Sarah sat beside him and asked, "Why don't you tell anyone your story? Don't you want people to know who you are?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes, when people know too much, they treat you differently. I just want to experience things without expectations." Sarah thought about that. In hostels, it was true, people often judged based on stories. The one who had climbed the highest mountain, or traveled the most countries, always became the center of attention. Maybe James just wanted to avoid that competition. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more. His knowledge, his skills, his calm confidence, it didn't come from nowhere. He wasn't just an ordinary backpacker. That night, as she lay in bed, she remembered his words from the balcony, "Sometimes, silence says more than words." She wondered what silence was hiding in his case. And deep down, she knew it was only a matter of time before his story revealed itself. The morning was bright, and the hostel buzzed with energy. A group of travelers had planned a boat trip to explore hidden caves along the coastline. Sarah was excited. She had always loved the sea, and this tour promised adventure. Everyone gathered near the beach, carrying bags of snacks, sunscreen, and cameras. James was there too, standing quietly a little apart from the group. He wore his usual plain clothes and carried only a small bag. Sarah noticed that while others were laughing and shouting with excitement, he seemed calm, almost as if he was waiting for something. The group made their way down the sandy path toward the boats tied at the shore. The water sparkled under the morning sun, and seagulls circled overhead. Just as the boat owner was preparing to welcome the group, a strange noise filled the air. At first, it was faint, like a distant hum. Then it grew louder, sharper. The sound of rotating blades cut through the air. Everyone stopped and looked up. From the sky, a helicopter appeared, its blades glinting in the sunlight as it descended toward the open space near the beach. People gasped, some shielding their eyes from the wind as sand scattered everywhere. The boat trip was forgotten for a moment, all attention was on the powerful machine landing just meters away. The travelers stood frozen, staring. Who could it be? Why was a helicopter landing here, in this small coastal town where life moved slowly and simply? To everyone's shock, James stepped forward. Without hesitation, he walked toward the helicopter, ducking slightly as the blades spun overhead. A crew member leaned out, handing him a headset. He put it on casually, like it was the most normal thing in the world. The entire hostel group stood in disbelief. Sarah's mouth fell open. She couldn't believe her eyes. The quiet guy, the one who blended into the background, the one who seemed like just another backpacker, he was walking straight into a helicopter as if he owned it. Someone whispered, "Wait, is that his helicopter?" Another laughed nervously, "No way. He's been living in a hostel like us." But their jokes fell silent as James turned back, his calm eyes meeting Sarah's. He motioned toward her, signaling with his hand for her to come closer. For a second, she froze. Was he really inviting her? "Go," one of her hostel friends nudged her, wide-eyed. "He's calling you." Heart racing, Sarah stepped forward, her feet sinking into the sand. The wind from the blades whipped her hair around, and her pulse thumped in her ears. As she approached, James held out a spare headset and smiled. "Want to come?" he asked simply, his voice steady despite the roar of the helicopter. Sarah hesitated only for a moment before nodding. With a mix of excitement and disbelief, she climbed in beside him. The others stood on the beach, cheering and waving, still shocked at what they were witnessing. Some pulled out their phones to record the moment, unable to believe that their quiet hostel mate had just revealed himself as someone with access to a helicopter. The machine lifted off the ground, the beach shrinking beneath them. Sarah's stomach flipped as they rose higher and higher, the coastline stretching out like a map. The ocean sparkled endlessly, cliffs stood tall against the waves, and the town looked tiny from above. She turned to James, her eyes wide. You fly helicopters." He glanced at her, amused by her surprise. "Sometimes." "Sometimes," she repeated in disbelief. "James, you've been living like a simple backpacker in a hostel. And now you're flying a helicopter? Who are you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he focused on the controls, guiding the helicopter smoothly along the coast. The headset crackled as he spoke again. "I'm a pilot. It's my job, but I don't usually talk about it." Sarah's mind raced. A pilot? That explained his calm nature, his knowledge of weather, his confidence on difficult trails. It all made sense now. "But why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked. He gave a small smile, his eyes still on the horizon. "Because I wanted people to see me for who I am, not for what I do. In hostels, when people hear something like this, they treat you differently. I didn't want that." Sarah sat back, stunned. It was true. If he had told them on the first day, everyone would have crowded around him, asking questions, treating him like someone special. Instead, he had chosen to stay quiet, blending in with everyone else. For a while, they flew in silence, the only sound being the steady beat of the blades. Sarah gazed out the window, her heart racing with excitement. The caves they had planned to see by boat were now visible from above, carved beautifully into the cliffs. The view was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Finally, she turned back to him. "You're full of surprises, James. I thought you were just the quiet guy in the corner." He laughed softly. "Maybe I liked it that way." The helicopter continued along the coast, dipping lower to give her a closer view of the sparkling water. Sarah couldn't stop smiling. The thrill of flying mixed with the shock of discovering who James really was made her feel like she was in a movie. When they finally landed back near the town, a small crowd had gathered, including the hostel group. Everyone clapped and cheered as the helicopter touched down. James removed his headset calmly, stepping out as if nothing unusual had happened. Sarah followed, still breathless from the experience. The group rushed toward them, firing questions all at once. "Are you serious? You're a pilot? Why didn't you say anything? Do you own that helicopter?" James raised his hands, smiling politely. "Yes, I'm a pilot." "No, I don't own it. It belongs to the company I work for. I just had access to it today." The group buzzed with excitement, but James didn't boast. He didn't act superior or proud. He answered simply, without exaggeration, the same way he always had. Sarah stood beside him, watching how easily he handled the attention. She realized that even now, he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just being himself, calm, modest, and genuine. That night, the hostel was livelier than ever. Everyone wanted to sit near James, asking him about flying, about the places he had been, about his experiences in the sky. He answered a few questions, but whenever the attention grew too heavy, he gently turned the conversation back to others, asking about their stories. Sarah couldn't help but admire him. Even with such an extraordinary life, he chose to stay grounded. He didn't crave fame or admiration. He valued simplicity. Later, when most people had gone to sleep, Sarah found him again on the balcony. She sat beside him quietly, the stars shining brightly above. "You really surprised me today," she admitted with a smile. James looked at her, his expression soft. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted to enjoy traveling like anyone else. But sometimes, the truth comes out on its own." Sarah nodded slowly. "I think it makes sense now, why you were so quiet, why you never tried to show off. You wanted to be normal for once." He didn't answer, but his smile said enough. As they sat in silence, Sarah realized something important. People often rush to judge others by what they see on the surface. But sometimes, the quietest person in the room carries the most extraordinary story. And James was living proof of that. The morning after the helicopter ride, the hostel buzzed with a different kind of energy. Travelers who had once overlooked James now looked at him with wide eyes and whispered conversations. For days, he had been just the quiet guy in the corner, and suddenly he was the center of every discussion. Sarah noticed how quickly things had changed. People who never cared to ask James a single question before were now eager to sit with him, talk to him, and know every detail of his life. Some wanted to hear about the helicopter, others wanted to know where he had traveled, and a few even hinted at wanting a free ride someday. But James remained the same. He didn't act proud or try to dominate the attention. Instead, he spoke with the same calmness as before, often turning the focus back on others. When someone asked, "What's the most exciting place you've flown to?" he replied with a smile, "Every place is exciting in its own way. But what about you? What's the most beautiful place you've visited so far?" It was as if he had no interest in being the star of the room. He had revealed his secret, yes, but he hadn't changed. And that, Sarah realized, was what made him extraordinary. Later that afternoon, Sarah found herself walking along the beach. The waves rolled gently, leaving foamy patterns on the sand. She thought about the last few days, the way she had first seen James as just another backpacker, the curiosity that had slowly built inside her, and the shocking moment when he had stepped into that helicopter like it was the most natural thing in the world. Her thoughts were interrupted when she saw James walking toward her, his hands in his pockets. He joined her quietly, and they walked side by side, listening to the sound of the ocean. "You've been quiet today," he said after a while. She laughed softly. "That's usually your role, not mine." He smiled at that, then looked out at the horizon. "I guess things feel different now, don't they?" Sarah nodded. "Everyone looks at you differently. They all want to know your story now." James sighed lightly. "That's what I wanted to avoid. When people know too much, they stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as something else. That's why I usually keep it simple." Sarah thought about his words. She could understand what he meant. In the hostel, travelers often competed to tell the most adventurous story. But James had chosen not to play that game. He had lived quietly, letting his actions speak instead of his words. "You know," Sarah said slowly, "I think you taught me something important. I realized how quickly I judged you at first. I thought you were just shy, maybe even boring. But I was wrong. You weren't boring, you were just living differently. And maybe that's better. James looked at her with a gentle expression. We all make assumptions. That's human nature. But sometimes, if we look a little deeper, we find something unexpected. They continued walking, the sand cool beneath their feet. Sarah felt a calmness she hadn't felt before. Being around James was like that. He didn't overwhelm with noise or big gestures, but his quiet presence always made her think more deeply. That evening, the hostel group decided to have a farewell dinner for a few travelers who were leaving the next day. The long wooden table in the common room was filled with food: pasta, rice, bread, and fruits. Someone played the guitar, and laughter filled the air. James sat among them, joining in but never taking the spotlight. Sarah noticed how he asked small, thoughtful questions to everyone, making each person feel important. It was as if his real gift wasn't flying helicopters but making others feel heard. As the night grew late, Sarah found herself on the balcony again, staring at the stars. James joined her quietly, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He handed one to her without a word, and for a while, they both just sat there, sipping in silence. Finally, Sarah spoke. So, what happens after this? Will you keep traveling like a backpacker, staying in hostels, blending in? James chuckled softly. Maybe. I like living this way. It reminds me of the simple things in life. My job can be intense, full of responsibility. When I travel like this, nobody expects anything from me. I can just be myself. Sarah nodded slowly, understanding. And people like me will keep wondering who you really are. He smiled. Maybe that's part of the fun. They both laughed quietly. The next morning, Sarah woke up early to see the sun rise. To her surprise, James was already outside, watching the sky change colors. The town was quiet, the waves soft, the air fresh. It felt like a perfect ending to the story they had shared. As she stood beside him, she realized she had learned something she would carry forever. Life wasn't about rushing to show who you were or proving yourself louder than others. Sometimes, the quietest presence carried the deepest lessons. James turned to her and said, "You'll leave soon, right?" She nodded. "Yes, tomorrow." "What about you?" He shrugged. "I'll stay for a few more days, maybe move to another town. Who knows?" There was no finality in his tone, no big dramatic farewell. That was James, calm, steady, and always living in the moment. When the time came for Sarah to leave, the hostel gathered to say goodbye. She hugged her new friends, promising to stay in touch. Finally, she turned to James. "Thank you," she said simply. "For the tea, for the hike, for the lesson I didn't even know I needed." James gave her a quiet smile. "Safe travels, Sarah. Keep looking beyond the surface. You'll find more stories that way." And with that, he gave a small wave. No grand gestures, no long speeches. Just a quiet farewell. As Sarah walked away with her backpack, she looked back one last time. James was sitting on the balcony, sipping his tea, looking as ordinary as ever. But to her, he was anything but ordinary. On the bus ride out of town, Sarah replayed everything in her mind. The first time she had seen him sitting alone in the hostel, the hikes, the notebook, the helicopter, the conversations under the stars. Each piece fit together like a puzzle, forming a picture of someone who had chosen simplicity over show, humility over pride. And she realized the greatest lesson James had given her: never judge a person by how loudly they speak or how much they show. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories belong to the quietest souls. She smiled to herself, knowing this was one memory she would carry forever.